We're on Daf Tzadiyom and Days, and we're up to Toshma. So you'll see Tosas Dibra Masechet Ligmar Minei, if you count down about 6 or 7 lines, and the first word in the line is Be'ila, so we're about 15, 20 lines from the top, down from the top, Toshma. And again, we're going to try to prove Rav Chizda's principle that Yesh Kof Biad Chacham Lakar Dover Minato, even B'Kuvase. Toshma, Rabbi Loza ben Yaakov, Shamati, I have a tradition from my Rabbeim, Shebezdin Makim the Onshim Shalom in Torah, that Bezdin are authorized to implement malchus and other punishments, like, for example, Misa, even against the Torah law, meaning the Torah says that so-and-so is not chayav an onish. But the Rabbanan can determine that he is chayav an onish. And why would they do such a thing? Elolaso skagla Torah. It is I can't remember, there's a phrase in Latin for this, that the courts are granted extra legal powers that they can use whenever necessary if things are borderline anarchy in society. And to make a siyad, meaning to protect the Torah, sometimes Chachamim have to take the initiative and implement punishments shelo lefi din Torah, in order to protect the Torah itself. And we have 2 examples of this. We have Maisa ba'adam echad, sherochav al asus b'Shabbos b'mei Yevanim. During the period of the Greeks, he was caught riding a horse in public on Shabbos, which is a violation of a shvus, a rabbinic prohibition, which was instituted as a gzera because he might be over tolesh, he might grab a branch from a tree and rip it off. And the violation of a shvus would certainly not incur misa, not even malchus, and yet heviu lebezdin uskalu. They gave him the status of someone who was machal Shabbos in one of the malachos, and they stoned him to death. Lo mipnei sheroy lekach, ela shashot tzricha lekach. He doesn't deserve an ownership of skila according to Torah law. He didn't violate any malacha per se. He only violated shvus d'Rabbanan. And that shvus d'Rabbanan is codified at the end of Masechet Beitza lo rofen al gabi behemoth Shabbos, but hashot tzricha. That during this period of the Yevanim, when the Greeks were subjugating the Jews and they instituted all sorts of decrees to try to be mavatal lemitzvahs, because they found the mitzvahs despicable in their eyes. So they were so prutz about Vera that one of their main targets was to be mezalzel in Shabbos. And as a result of their zilzel in Shabbos, it somehow was making waves and penetrating a little bit into the psyche of the people of Israel. Rabbanan felt they had to take a very strong stand here to protect the future of Shabbos, the observance of Shabbos, and even for a violation of a shvus of ein rofen al behem b'Shabbos, they implemented the ultimate capital punishment of Misa. They lamod b'peretz, because there was a peretz. Peretz means when the wall is breaking down, and the wall of the observance of Shabbos was breaking down. Could you imagine today? And because of this peretz, they went very far and took the most extreme position imaginable with regard to punishing anyone who violated the Shabbos, because by violating the Shabbos, even on a shvus level, he indicated that he was mezalzel Shabbos. And that was the biggest fear at the time of the Yevamot, that we would lose our national commitment and love for the Shabbos, to observe the Shabbos. Echmiru chachamim le'enosh bi'onesh chamur ha'over al isur midivrei. That's story number one. Shuv ma'aseh b'adam echad she'tiach bi'ishto tachas ha'te'ena. He had a relationship with his wife publicly, underneath a fig tree. Now, why it's important to know what kind of tree it was, I don't know. But maybe this gives it a little bit more of a real picture. You shouldn't think that the Chacham are inventing this. And it's different views. It's just a vision. This is an actual situation that happened. Eviyu lebesdin vehilkuhu. And they gave him malchus. They gave him lashes. Lomit nesharoy lekach. He didn't violate any technical avera, any lotas. It was just precepts. Ela shashot tzricha lekach. It was a time period in which there was so much precepts in arayas, and people were acting in a kind of a nude way. So here, to implement the act of intimacy in the public eye, that would further illustrate the preachers and sort of give the preachers even an extra element. The Chacham wanted to be what's called Migdar Milsa. You remember we had yesterday Migdar Milsa, right? When we discussed the case of someone who violates the word of a Navi, like the Nevi'ah Baal. So Eliyahu permitted bringing ulin and shechting it chutzli azara. That's called the Migdar Milsa, otherwise known as Hashad Tzricha. In any event, we see quite clearly that yesh koch b'yad chachamim lakar min adova b'kum vaseh, to implement malchus, or even moreover, worse than that, misa, for someone who, according to the Torah law, is not chayav in malchus. He doesn't deserve misa. That is an akiras dover min Torah. Now it's interesting because we had already tried in the past to prove Rav Chisda and establishing the Yesh Koch B'Yad Chacham based on Eliyahu Hanavi Bara Carmel, and we rejected that because of the principle of Migdar Milsa shining. Just a few lines up on this And here we have a clear case of Migdar Milsa shining. Why did the Gemara have to come up with Migdar Milsa shining a second time when we already had it a first time with regard to Eliyahu shechting karbanos outside of the Azor? Now, it could be that the Gemara's proof is really not from the second story, but rather from the first story. The second story is giving Malchus when the Torah doesn't advocate Malchus because he hasn't violated a law. So that realm of Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim is in the realm of Lavin, the punishment for which is Malchus. And the Rabbanan took the license to implement Malchus as if he had violated a law. But in the first story, the Rabbanan took license to condemn the sinner to death. We never found that the Rabbanan, for the sake of Migdar Milsa, could go beyond Lavin. Like, for example, Chulin, not Chulin, but I mean to say Shchutei Chutz, that's a getter of a lot, but no one would be put to death for violating the Isur of Shkutei Chut. Now we're taking someone who committed a public act of intimacy, and we're considering it as if he had violated a capital crime. We're putting him to death. Do we know that the purview and the scope of Migdal Milsa Shiny goes as far as to allow the Rabbanon, give them authority and license to implement a death penalty against the Torah law? And the Gemara answers yes. That's also considered Migdal Milsa Shiny. And for the sake of Migdal Milsa, then on a very temporary basis with each Shah, the Chachamim are authorized to be Oker, the Din Torah, the Kum V'aseh, even if it means putting the sin of the criminal to death. But as far as the Takana L'Doros is concerned, we don't find that the Chachamim are authorized to undermine the Torah law, the Kum V'aseh. So the bottom line is that the Gemara does not prove nor disprove Rav Chisda. But unfortunately, Rav Chisda has no source for his radical chiddush that Yesh Koch Bi'ad Chacham Lakar Dogman Torah Kum V'aseh. There is no basis, no proof to support Rav Chisda. And if you recall, Rav Chisda was willing to take Truma D'Oraisa and remove its status as Truma and make it into Chulin Gmurin in order to guarantee that the Mafresh Min HaTomei Alatar would replace this Hafrashas Truma of Tmeya with Hafrashas Truma Tahora. And by doing so, he negated the status of Truma, making it into Chulin. That's Akiras Dovim Min HaTorah. And do the Chacham actually have the authority to do so? That remains an unanswered question. Okay. So at this point, we go back to the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says that since this woman who got married based on one witness, the testimony of Eid Echad, now her husband is alive, she doesn't get any ksuba, she loses her ksuba from both the first husband and the second, then the Maisi Yodea, so too, neither the first husband nor the second have rights to her wages or her income. So the Gemara explains why the first Baal does not have rights to Maisi Yodea. Taimamai, what logic can you offer to justify the Mishnah's ruling that the first husband loses his rights to Maisi Yodea? Amri Rabbana Maisi Yodea lebaila, the rights that are granted by the Ksuba, by the Takonis Chachamim, to the Baal to collect her wages, that was a tit for tat relationship between the Ka'achla Mizoni, that he will provide her sustenance, called Mizonos, and she in turn will offer her wages, her profits to him. Not the profit with a PH that we're discussing in Eliyahu, now the profit with an F. And we have a tit per toe, a quid pro quo relationship here between husband and wife in the framework of the ksuba. Whereas he brings in the dough meaning the bread physically, and that's called mizonos. She will bring in the dough, meaning the salary check. So she works as a psychiatrist, she makes $500 a pop. You remember my joke about who's listening? And that $500 accrues to her husband and gives him the financial income to support her. But in this case, he's not going to be supporting her. Why? because Hacha came into Mizone Leslam, she cannot claim and demand that he pay for her upkeep, for her sustenance, because the ksuba is gone, is completely voided, is therefore Maisiyah del Avdideh. Since we gave him the Maisiyah in lieu of Mizonos, and now he's not giving up Mizonos, therefore he's not going to collect Maisiyah Dayim. And again, if you're asking why isn't he supporting her, the answer is because she lost her rights through the ksuba when she went ahead and married another man. So her first husband no longer is committed and obligated to pay whatever the ksuba normally would obligate a husband to pay, because that ksuba is null and void, and therefore he's not chayiv in mizonos. And the Mishnah says, therefore, he has to forfeit Maisiyah Dayim, because Maisiyah there was only given to him as a trade-off for mizonos, but he's not giving up mizonos. There's no ksuba, and hence he does not collect her Maisiyah Dayim. So the only thing she gains after all these penalties is that she can take her wages, her income, and put it into her own personal bank account. She doesn't have to share that income with anyone. The Mishnah says, "V'lo meifir nidorel." Her first husband does not have rights to nullify her vows. Why is that so? I mean, he's still a husband according to Torah law. Now, this is interesting. The Torah gives us a law, and the Rabbanan are going to ask, what is the reason for the law? That's called Taimei HaMitzvos. The Torah granted the husband, within the framework of marriage, the rights to nullify her pledges, her vows. Why? I don't know. I could have given you a number of answers, or I could just have said simply, it's Xeris HaKos. But the Gemara goes out on a limb. And Chazal say, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to reveal to you the reason why a Baal is made for Nidara. And that reasoning is going to limit the application and the scope of Baal made for Nidara. And the reason is Kadesh Lo Tizkan Al Baal. Let's say, for example, she took a neder that she won't bathe, or that she won't beautify herself with cosmetics. She now becomes menuva. She's disgusting. She's repulsive. She hasn't taken a shower. She hasn't used basic cosmetics. And we want to maintain shalom bayis. So we make a takana that Baal could be made for nidar. But Hacha, here in this case, Adara, we want to terminate this marriage. Tiskana, let her look ugly. Let's accept our rights to take a neder, shalo erchot, shalo eskashe, and the neder should be valid and binding. Now, my question to you is the following. Is this not kumvaseh? On a Doraisa level, the Baal's hafara is valid. The Torah granted him unconditional rights to annul her vows. He went in and did so in this scenario, and the Rabbanan said the annulment of the vow is annulled. The hafara is mufak, and therefore the neder is binding. So is that kumbaseh, or is it shevi altaseh? On the one hand, it's Kubase because the Rabbanan are actively negating his rights to Afaras Nedarim. But on the other hand, it's Shevi Altase because she will now have to observe her neder. And observing a neder is called Shevi Altase. Don't violate the neder actively. Remain passive so that you don't violate the neder. So Rabbanan are saying that lo mefer nidareah, that her nidarim are binding. Hence, that's called Shevi Altase. Now the Mishnah says, Haisa Bas Yisrael, Nifsala min HaKahuna. So her father is Israel. He married her off to a Kohen. And the Kohen went off to yonder. And now, after, I don't know how long, he comes back and he says, Ich bin du, I'm here. Noch gelebt, I still live. I'm not dead. You took me for dead, I'm alive. And she's been eating truma as an Ashes Kohen, Israelis, or call her Bas Yisrael. Shenisais LeKohen. And the Torah says, Kinyan Kaspo, and she can eat from truma. But now the Mishnah says, that's it. Nifsala min HaKahuna. Because any rights that she had to kahuna were not genetic inside her, but rather by virtue of the marriage. And now we want to terminate that marriage. And in the push to terminate the marriage, we will rob her of the special merits and rights that accrue to her by virtue of this marriage, namely the ability and the heter truma. Ubas Levi bin Meiser Rishon. She will now forfeit her rights to eat Meiser Rishon. So the Gemara immediately asks Pshita. Now what Pshita? Why is it so posh? In the eyes of the Gemara, that she loses her rights to any kahuna, like truma, any rights that she has by virtue of the marriage. He hasn't yet divorced her. She's still technically married to him. And the answer is, oh, see the first Rashi. An Ashes Ish that had a relationship outside of marriage is a zona. And a zona is excluded from kahuna. No rights of kahuna can be gained and acquired by a Bas Yisrael who married a Kohen if she is a zona. So pshita that she's psula min kahuna. Why did the Tana have to teach me this din? And the Gemara answers, you're right. The fact that she's psula min kahuna, pshita. But Bas Levi, nifsala min hamaser itzuvah. The psula min kahuna is unnecessary. It's only a lead-in to the chiddush that she's psula min al-leviyah, which means meiser that's given to a lady. And that's where I needed the Tana to tell me that she's possible. Why? Why is she possible? In the case of Truma, and she's an Israelis married to a Kohen, she's psula because she is a zona. But in Meiser Rishon, we don't have a concept of zona. So what makes this woman psula min hamaser? Bas Levi fragt die Gemara min hamaser mi bifsala. Does nus an immoral relationship disqualify a Bas Levi from eating Maser? But Tanya, we have a brisa that says Levia shenishbeis, o shenivala beilas nus, noslim la Maser rocheles. Now, nishbeis means that she was taken captive by the goyim, and the assumption is, unfortunately, that she was raped in captivity by a goy. And then we have a case of a Bas Levi who had a relationship with Bilas Nus, which could mean any of many different things. She had Be'ilu with a guy, with an Eved. And yet, in cases where she would definitely be disqualified from Truma, like, for example, a Zona because she was Nishbeis, or a Zona because she was Nivela B'Ilas Nus. But yet, as far as Levia is concerned, to eat Maser, no Sula Maser Rocheles. There's no Psul Zona, or for that matter, B'Ilas Nus with an Eved, etc., to passel her from eating Maser Rishon. So Bas Levi would not become disqualified from Maser because of, or as a result of, Be'ilas Nus. Now the Gemara at this point is analyzing our Mishnah from the perspective of the classic normal regulations that apply to passel a woman. In the case of Mina Kahuna, we have her status as a Zona, but what do we have that parallels that with regard to Maser? There is no Psul of Znus and Zona with regard to Maser. So where does the Mishnah come off formulating or ruling that a Bas Levi could no longer eat Maser? Or a Zona excluded from Kahuna and from Truma, but why is she excluded from Maser when we have a principle Bas Levi Shenishbeis o Nivala le'akum or le'eved Bilas Nus? We can still give him Maser. No similar Maser Rocheles. Rav Sheshes Nasa, you are absolutely right. If our Mishnah should be analyzed from the framework of classic regulations, then she should continue eating Maser Rishon. But the Chachamim looked for a way of Knas. They wanted to wave a thread over her head so that she would be absolutely dedicated to research, to investigation, to clarify whether her husband's alive or not. And the Rabbanan went very far. And they said to her, we warn you, if you don't do your due diligence and you flippantly decide, well, your husband's dead and you're going to marry another man, look at the repercussions. You're a Bas Levi. You've been eating Maser all your life. If your husband is alive and well and he shows up on 2 feet, forget it, my lady. You will not be eating Maser. Now, this is a pellet because even a knas has to fit in some sort of halachic frame of reference, some sort of halachic perspective. There is no din of kedusha to Maser Rishon. Maser Rishon is not endowed with sanctity. That's the same status as chulin. And now you're telling her that as a knas, she can no longer eat Maser. Anybody can eat Maser. It's chulin. So Tosfos, Dibra Maschil Omar, comes to the conclusion that this sugya reflects the sheet of Rabbi Meir, a unique sheet of Rabbi Meir. It's mentioned earlier in Masechet Yevamot that Meiser Rishon Osur Lizorin. That, my friend, if you're not a Levi, you are enjoined from eating Meiser Rishon. It means that Meiser Rishon has Kedusha, not the same Kedusha as Truma, but at least a low ebb Kedusha of Leviah. And therefore, it's shaykh to talk about a knas to prohibit a bas Leviah from eating maser. Because you cannot eat maser unless you're a Levi. And even though she is a Levi, she will not be able to eat maser because of the knas. That makes sense if and only if we accept Rabbi Meir's shita that maser rishon is also lizorin, which means that maser rishon is endowed with kedusha. The Chachamim rejected Rabbi Meir. They held that maser rishon is pure chulin. And Tosfos says that if you accept the shita of Chachamim, then it's nonsensical to talk about a knas such that a bas Levi cannot eat maser rishon. Anyone could eat maser rishon. And I'll read to you the language here that the Sifti says, L'Rabbanan, Shemaser Rishon Mutal Lizorin, which means that Maser Rishon is pure chulin and it's not endowed with any status of Hekesh. Lo Shayach Lomer Shekansu Osa Shehedina Chamur Mi Zara Gemura. Zara Gemura means a woman who's not a Levi. She's at least a Levi. And even a woman who's not a Levi, according to the Rabbanon of Rabbi Meir, is allowed to eat Maser Rishon. Oh, now Tosfos offers a second pasuk. Nomar shaknasu gam aliva d'Rabbanan. Even the Rabbanan could accept the knas that enjoins this woman who's a bas Leviah from eating maser rishon. How so? Konsu le'inyan she'ein nosnin lo maser rishon. Avalo asur alea achilas maser machmas knas. Shari maser rishon mutal lizon. Tosfos offers a suggestion that the knas was that we are not allowed to give her maser rishon. She's not on our list, our radar screen of recipients for our maser rishon. Any maser rishon that she has access to, she can eat. But we are not going to give her maser rishon. Why? Because of a knas. Because she should not have relied on one witness who testified that her husband died without doing absolute investigation to be 100% clear that he died. And then we find out that, lo and behold, he's alive. She didn't do her investigation. She didn't do her proper work. We are going to hit her with the kitchen sink with all these knossos. And no one is allowed to give her maser rishon. So if I were to quiz you and ask you, which case of maser rishon generates an isur that you're not allowed to give the maser rishon to a Levi or to a bas Levi? And the answer is this scenario in our Mishnah, according to the second shita in Tosfos, that the Rabbanon, even though maser rishon is mutal lizorin, would agree that we are not allowed to give her maser rishon. Want to add the Orchaner's comments here to this sugya, and he's bothered by the following. Okay, the Gemara is objecting to the psul of Bas Levia from Maser after the Gemara established that when the Tana mentions the psul of kahuna, it mentions agav Maser. And then the Gemara says, wait a second, there's a fundamental difference between the two. And Bas Levi min Maser mi mifsal. The Gemara's question about the psul of Bas Levi min Levia seems to follow the discussion about Bas Yisrael min Truma. And the Orchaner is bothered by this. He says, Hare Kushizu, the basic problem or objection to Bas Levia min Maser, Yesh Lakshos B'fnei Atzal Mishnah. The Mishnah itself makes no sense. Loman if seles min Maser, Hare Bas Levi gam im Zinsa einen if seles min Maser. And he gives an interesting answer. He says, Hagemar Yadashef Shalomar Shekansua Yosef Mishar Bas Levi Shezinsa. That would make sense even according to the Makshon, that they certainly would impose a penalty on this woman after Znus. And that goes beyond a normal situation of a Bas Levi eating Maser. And even if a normal Bas Levi Shezinsa is not Nifselis Min HaKahuna, could be that this would be worse. Pansua Mishar, Yosef Mishar Bas Levi Shezinsa. She's even worse than a classic Znus. And the reason is perhaps to prevent the woman from getting married and assuming her husband was dead just based on the testimony of one witness. El Shemeach Gemara Omer Shemash Omer Tana Nifselis Min HaKahuna. That kahuna itself, and the fact that she, as a zona, cannot eat truma, that's pshita. But it was mentioned together with maser, agav maser. Imken, machma, shigam masha nifsala, min maser, hu da'oraisa. Sorry, masha nifsala min kahuna da'oraisa, right? A zona can't eat truma da'oraisa. And it would sound like if that halach is being dragged in agav, the halach of maser, then it would seem like maser is doraisa. That the psul of truma, which is doraisa, is agav, is schlepped in incidentally because of the din d'Rabbanan of a knas that she shouldn't eat maser. That doesn't make sense. It would seem like her psul for maser is doraisa. And the answer is that we don't accept that digduk. Omar agav kach psul kahuna dorais. Now, our Girsa in the Gemara says pshita on a halacha psul kahuna. There's another Girsa in the Ramban. His Girsa is pshita zonahi. How do we justify the Girsa of Rashi that rejects the word zona? Why should she be psula for kahuna? Is there some problem with adding zona? So the Ramban mentions that this issue of zona is a machlokes earlier in Masechet Yevamot Adaf Vav in Ba'ones in Nase zona. And there's one shita that if a Bas Kohen was raped, she is not possible as a zona. The Ramban says that we should not interpret the Gemara as meaning that she's psula bidin zona, but rather the Gemara means that kitia leish zar, which the Gemara early in Yevamot Sadaf Samaches darshins kevin shenivel apostla minakavuna, that within that context of nifsala apostla minakuna ein chiluk bein ones l'rotz. And even an ones is considered nivelal apostle. Only with regard to zona, there might be a difference between ones and rotzon, and ones is not called znutz. But as far as the mitzias of nifsal apostle, there is no difference between ones and rotzon. And therefore, when the Gemara says pshita the zona here, according to that case, it really doesn't necessarily mean zona, because according to one man the Omer, if it's an ones without rotzon, she's not a zona, but rather it means that she's nivelal apostle. All right, then. So here's where we're going to stop. We're up to Bas Kohen Minat Truma. Here on the top of Daf Sadi Aleph, Omid Aleph. And that's 5 lines down from the top, which Mitzvah will continue on Yom Nishon. Thank you very much for a great week, and have a wonderful Shabbos Parshas Shoftim.